Now remember too, this is a time when students got their email addresses when they came to school. Now they have 4 or 5 when they come to school. And the school one is where all the grown-ups are trying to, grown-ups and old people, right, are trying to get in touch with them. But in the mid-90s, no. Email was a new thing. So I decided to run a listserv. And though this is a much later version of Novell Groupwise than the one that I was running at the time, it looked about the same. Didn't have as much spam back then. But that was the inbox. And we would talk to each other via the listserv, and email would come into the inbox. Now, who were we? I was parallel teaching a section with a colleague who was also interested in online communication. We did not team teach it, but we had the same syllabus. We taught at different times. Our students could interact on the listserv. I had never done that before. I was a new faculty member, so there are lots of things I hadn't done before, but he hadn't done it either. What would it be like if somebody else in somebody else's section with a common syllabus with yours, if they could interact with, wouldn't that cause chaos? What would that be like? What if Bill Kemp did something really interesting on a day when I was a dud? And so the students in his section would be pounding out their emails with a listserv on how Dr. Kemp had changed their lives, and my students were going, gosh, I wish we had signed up for Bill Kemp's section. Dr. Campbell's. And then what would I do? I'd be found out, the imposter syndromes. None of that happened, of course. There were days when I hit homers and he didn't. There were days when he did and I didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered is that the students could watch each other learning. They could see signs of attention and addressivity that were not limited to class meetings, not limited to a particular section of a course, but could be shared, could be seen, could be experienced. And at the time, email was so exotic that it was kind of cool to be getting this stuff. Oh, I have an email address. What's that? And this is the way this would go. Did things always go smoothly? No. First time I tried it, something like 2,500 archived emails vanished when someone who was new at the networking game switched a particular setting on the email server for the university. Not good. I had a backup, though. They were all archived on Paprika, which my buddy had set up as a secondary. But that was complete luck. I didn't set out to do that. It didn't matter. We had real communication. We had flame wars. Something was at stake for these students. And then the other shoe fell at a dinner party with a colleague. He had a friend from Georgetown who was a German instructor who was also running a listserv in her class. And we were chatting about our experiences online. You know, geeks always like to chatter excitedly to each other. And she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, what I like about a listserv is that when my students are on the listserv and they're writing to each other in German, I can see what's happening in their language acquisition in ways that I can't see if they're writing papers or taking tests or talking to me, because they're in an authentic conversational encounter. And I can see it happening as it happens, and it doesn't go away, because the stuff is all archived. Well, these were native speakers of English I had in my class, but they were acquiring a language. The language was that of reasoned, critical discourse in writing, as they tackled some very difficult essays. And I thought, is that what I'm seeing? And I went and looked for it, and son of a gun, there it was. Now, it was casual. There was a lot of chatter, right? The flame wars would get ridiculous. We had a person who was very into Ayn Rand. And what's her philosophy? Objectivism, is that it? Yeah. And so for him, the whole course was bogus. And he talked about that, I think, about 3 times a week for at least 12 weeks. That was tough. The signal-to-noise ratio was kind of low, sort of like life. But I could see their cognition. I could see the cognition prints. So I got very excited about this. I started using listservs for all my classes, of course, and I'll tell you why that's not a great idea in a little bit, or maybe you're already there before me. But I thought, I can see inside the black box of the learner's mind in a way I could not before. Not only that, they could see it as well in each other. So, from that, I think about three principles that I have generalized as I try to consider what that all adds up to. And I put this in different ways. This is something I'm still trying to understand. I don't think I'll ever get to the bottom of it. But I think that there are things that were important about this experience that can be summed up with three principles. One is observability. This concept comes from Everett Rogers' book, Diffusing Innovations, which has to do with why some things catch on and other things do not. One example of observability that he has, which will be very familiar to all of us, is the cell phone. It turns out that it matters that you see other people using that, because you say, oh, what's that? Where did you get it? What is it like? And of course, I don't have to have a password to do your cell phone, I just have to have a cell phone. So you can loan it to me and say, try it out. It's another concept called trialability. But observability becomes very, very important. This is linked to a fundamental academic value, which often doesn't occur in the classroom: publication. Students don't publish their work in the classroom. They just hand it to us, we mark it, we hand it back. That's not observable. They don't see each other's work in the classroom. Any innovation, and I would submit that all education is innovation for the learner at the point of learning, should be observable. But no, not in a lot of our signature pedagogies. And OER stands for Open Educational Resources, which has to do with a new movement in education, not all that new, it's been going on for a little bit, but it's fairly innovative, that the stuff we generate, the knowledge we create as educators, as learners, now including students in our learning communities, ought to be in the open. So it is observable. So it is shareable. So observability was happening in these listservs. The learners could see each other learning in ways that they couldn't before. Persistence is another thing that we were all seeing. They had those emails. They didn't go away. One of the fun things we would do at the end of the term is go back and look at the emails from the beginning of the term. What's happened? What's happened with your experience of school? What's happened with your experience of this course? Your experience of each other? And it turns out that the persistence was not just about the persistence of the conversation. Some of that networking became social as well. So that 4 years later, when some of the students in that first class went with me for a study abroad experience, they were still friends with each other. They were still in touch with each other. Now there's some ideas that fall under persistence that have to do specifically with Web 2.0. You'll hear me talk about them as we move through. The idea of syndication, that when the material is generated, it can be sent in many different directions, that persistence can be republished and repurposed in many different areas. Search becomes important for persistence. I cannot go and execute a search on the writing I did as an undergraduate, though I have kept most of my papers, both to reassure myself that it wasn't that bad, but also so that I don't get my standards so far above what I was able to do as an undergrad that I wreak havoc on my undergrads. But search becomes important. You're going to see in a little bit an example of student publication in which search can matter. Do students think that they're creating resources that they should be able to search through? Not unless they're going to get the box out, right, and start rippling through the papers. The hyperlink is an example of persistence because it takes something relevant in one context, links it to something in another context, that becomes synergistic, greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the long tail, which is a classic Web 2.0 phenomenon in which something that's created and is useful may be useful to 50 people all at once or 5 people a year for 10 years and have a similar transformative effect in each case. And then finally, and most importantly, and this worked better when email was new, wouldn't really work so well with email now, is the idea of intimacy. It gets next to you. It has to do with you. Not in a kind of crass way to pander to people's individual sort of trivial preferences, but having to do with you. Addressivity means turning to someone. That's an act of intimacy. And when we scale education, when we put people through a particular process, in the chute at matriculation, out at commencement, intimacy sometimes gets left behind. Sometimes it's a positive nuisance.